My wife filed for divorce 3 days before I came home from war. I didn't find that out at the airport, and I didn't find it out in a hospital, or a courtroom, or any of the places you'd expect a man to learn something like that. I found it out sitting behind the wheel of my own truck, parked in a lot at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, with the engine still ticking as it cooled down, a folded piece of paper waiting for me on the passenger seat like it had been sitting there for years instead of hours. And the strangest part of this whole story isn't that she wanted to leave me. The strangest part is what I found out 6 weeks later about why. If you stay with me to the end, I promise you it's not the story you think it is. My name doesn't matter much for what I'm about to tell you, so just call me what my men called me. Sergeant. I spent 11 years in the United States Army, 2 deployments to Afghanistan. The second one in a valley so narrow the sun didn't touch the bottom of it until almost 10 in the morning. Like the whole place had been built to keep the light out on purpose. I want to tell you about coming home. Not the kind of coming home you see in commercials, with confetti and a marching band and a little girl in a yellow dress running across an airport floor into her daddy's open arms. I want to tell you about the real kind. The kind where the hardest fighting doesn't start until after the shooting stops, and nobody warns you about that part, and nobody hands you a manual for it either. I grew up in a town so small it didn't get its first stoplight until 2003, and half the town complained about it for a year afterward, like the light itself was some kind of government overreach. One gas station, one diner called the Sunrise that served the same 4 pies on rotation depending on the day of the week. A Baptist church with a bell that still had to be rung by hand because nobody ever got around to fixing the automatic system after it broke sometime in the 90s. A high school where every kid's parents had gone to school with every other kid's parents, so there was no such thing as a secret, not really. Not for long. I met Emily there, in 10th grade chemistry, in a classroom that smelled permanently like sulfur and old textbooks. She sat 2 seats ahead of me, and I spent an entire semester staring at the back of her head instead of at the periodic table, memorizing the way her ponytail moved when she laughed at something the girl next to her said. She had a laugh that came out before she meant it to, like it surprised even her, like it snuck past whatever polite filter she usually kept over herself. I fell for that laugh a long time before I ever worked up the nerve to say more than 10 words to her directly. It took me until junior year to actually talk to her, and even then it was an accident. I dropped my binder in the hallway between second and third period, papers scattering everywhere, and she was the only one who stopped to help me pick them up instead of stepping over them like everyone else did. She handed me my homework with a look that was somewhere between pity and amusement, and she said, "You're the boy who stares at the back of my head in chemistry." I turned red enough that she laughed again. That same surprised laugh, and I decided right then I would spend the rest of my life trying to earn that sound. We started dating that spring. Nothing fancy, a movie in the next town over because ours didn't have a theater, milkshakes at the Sunrise, afterward long drives on back roads with the windows down, because gas was the one thing we could actually afford on a 17-year-old's budget. She wanted to be a nurse. I didn't know what I wanted to be, which is a hard thing to admit to a girl who already knows exactly who she's going to become. But she never made me feel small for not having it figured out. She used to say, "You'll get there. Some people just take the scenic route." I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the years since. We got married young, 22 years old, in her father's backyard, under a string of lights her mother hung from the old oak tree the evening before, working past dark with a headlamp strapped to her forehead because she refused to let anyone else do it. I remember the pastor asking if I'd take her for better or for worse. And I remember thinking, standing there in a rented suit that didn't quite fit through the shoulders, I don't even know what worse looks like yet. I found out. Everybody finds out eventually if they stay long enough. That's what a marriage actually is, I think, more than the wedding part ever tells you. It's finding out what worse looks like together, one hard season at a time, and choosing to stay through it anyway, over and over, long after the string lights have come down. I joined the Army 2 years after we married. Money was part of the reason. We didn't have much, and Emily was working double shifts at the hospital just to keep us afloat while I tried to make it as an electrician's apprentice that never quite panned out. Always one licensing exam behind where I needed to be. But if I'm going to be honest with you, and I promised myself at the start of telling this story that I would be honest all the way through, the money wasn't the whole reason. There was something in me that needed to prove I was more than just a boy from a town with one stoplight everybody had complained about. I needed to matter, out there somewhere, on some scale bigger than the one I'd grown up on. I didn't understand yet that I already mattered more than I could have known to the one person whose opinion of me should have counted the most. It took me a long time and a great deal of loss to learn that particular lesson. Some men learn it in a classroom. I had to learn it in a hospital hallway, which I'll get to. My first deployment was hard in the ordinary ways. Deployments are hard: the heat, the boredom that turns into terror without warning, the letters that took 10 days to arrive and felt like 10 years by the time they did. But it was the second deployment that changed everything, and that's the one I need to walk you through carefully, because that's where I met a man named Daniel Reyes, and Daniel Reyes is the reason any of the rest of this happened at all. Danny was younger than me by about 4 years, from a small town outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the first time I ever laid eyes on him, he was crouched over a broken Humvee radio, trying to fix it with a paper clip, and what I only describe as pure stubbornness, cursing at it under his breath in a mix of English and Spanish that made even the guys who didn't understand a word of it start laughing. He kept a photograph of his baby daughter taped to the inside of his helmet, worn soft at the corners from how often he pulled it out to look at it, and he used to talk about her like she was already grown. Already had a career picked out, already had a wedding day. He was planning down to the flowers he'd insist on for walking her down the aisle someday. He talked about the future, like it was a guarantee somebody had already signed for him. I think that's just what young men do when they haven't yet been given a reason not to. I think that's part of what makes losing them so unbearable when it happens. The future they were so sure of gets ripped away before they ever get to test whether it was real. Danny and I ended up bunked near each other for most of that deployment, and over the months we built the kind of friendship that only happens in places where every day carries the possibility of being somebody's last. He taught me a card game his grandfather had taught him, something involving a deck missing 4 cards that nobody could ever explain, and I taught him how to properly season a steak, a skill he insisted was wasted on a man who'd probably never see a real grill again once we got sent somewhere without one. We talked about home more than we talked about anything else. He told me about his older brother Marcus, who'd raised him for a stretch after their fathers left, who Danny said was the toughest and gentlest man he'd ever known, both at once, which Danny said was rare and worth respecting when you found it in somebody. We were on a patrol in October, moving through a village that had gone quiet in a way that made the hair stand up on the back of my arms before my brain had even caught up to why. I've learned since then to trust that feeling without question, that cold prickle down your neck when something in the air has changed, before you can name what it is. We took fire from a ridgeline above us, and in the chaos of it, in the dust and the shouting and the world narrowing down to noise, Danny went down covering the youngest guy in our squad, a 19-year-old private from Ohio who still had acne scattered across his chin and had only been in country for 6 weeks. I got to Danny before the medic did. I held pressure on a wound in his side with both hands, while the whole world shrank down to just his face, my hands, and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding against my eardrums. He wasn't afraid. I need you to understand that clearly, because it's the part of this memory I return to the most. He looked up at me, blood-slicked and pale, and he wasn't afraid for himself at all. He said, "Sergeant, if I don't make it, you find my brother. Tell him to look after my little girl and her mama. Promise me." His voice didn't shake when he said it. Mine did when I answered. I promised him. What else do you say to a dying man asking you for the one thing he has left to ask for? You promise him anything. Danny didn't make it. He died on the helicopter 11 minutes later, somewhere over terrain I couldn't see because I was pinned in the back holding what was left of his hand. And I carried that promise home with me like a stone lodged behind my ribs, heavier than any pack I ever wore, heavier than anything I'd carried in 11 years of service. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I believe it matters for understanding everything that happened after. When you watch a man die holding your hands, something in you doesn't come home the same way it left. Part of you stays behind, in that dirt, in that valley, in that exact moment, on a loop that plays whether you want it to or not. I came home from that deployment a different man than the one who'd shipped out, and Emily, God bless her, God keep her, was the one who had to live with whoever it was that came back in my place, a man she barely recognized some nights, who flinched at car doors, slamming, and woke up swinging at nothing. Let's go back to the letter, because I think I owe you the full weight of what it said before I go any further. For 6 weeks, I believed something about my wife that turned out to be about as far from the truth as a thing can get. And that misunderstanding nearly cost me the only good thing I had left standing in my life. The letter said, "I can't do this anymore. I've made a decision, and I need you to let me go without a fight. Please don't come looking for explanations. Just sign the papers when they arrive. I'm sorry. I loved you the best way I knew how. Emily." No goodbye at the airport. No hug on the tarmac, no flag, no confetti, none of it. Just a folded piece of paper on the seat of a truck a neighbor had driven over for me. because apparently my own wife couldn't bring herself to be the one to hand me my own set of keys. I sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes without turning the engine over. Guys from my unit walked past me toward their own reunions, toward wives running at them across the pavement in the afternoon sun, toward kids screaming daddy and leaping into arms that had been empty for a year. I watched a staff sergeant I'd served 3 deployments with drop to one knee right there in the lot, laughing as his 2 boys tackled him at the same time. I sat there with a letter that felt like a court sentence, wondering what in the hell I had done wrong from 6,000 miles away to deserve reading this instead of hearing it, or better yet, not reading it at all, because it wasn't true. Though I didn't know that yet. I want to tell you, because I think some of you watching this have lived some version of it yourselves. There is a specific, particular kind of pain in coming home from war to discover that the home part of it isn't there waiting for you anymore. You survive things that by all rights should have killed you. You come back changed, quieter in some rooms and louder in others, jumping at sounds that never used to bother you, sleeping with one eye open out of a habit your body refuses to unlearn even in a bed that's perfectly safe. And then you find out the person you were fighting to get back to has already, in her own private way, said her goodbyes without you. I drove to our house anyway. I don't fully know why, except that I didn't know where else a man in my position was supposed to go. The porch light was on. Her car sat in the driveway in the same spot it always did. And through the front window I saw her, moving slowly around the kitchen, in a robe I recognized. Her hair pulled back the plain way, she always wore it when she didn't want to be bothered with it. She looked thinner than I remembered her, tired in a way that had nothing to do with a long day at work, though I didn't know then how right that observation would turn out to be. I didn't go in. I sat in that truck on the street outside my own house for another 20 minutes, staring at the woman I loved through a lit window, feeling like a stranger, like a man peering into somebody else's life through a pane of glass that might as well have been a mile thick. Then a car pulled up along the curb. A dark blue sedan, nothing fancy, nothing flashy. A man climbed out. Mid-40s, maybe, in a plain button-down shirt, carrying a leather bag in one hand. The kind that made me think, in that first ugly instant, of an old-fashioned doctor's bag, though I pushed that thought aside almost as fast as it arrived, because a doctor's bag didn't fit the story my mind was already busy constructing. Emily opened the front door before he'd even had the chance to knock, and she let him inside like it was something the two of them had done 100 times before. The porch light clicked off a few seconds later. I want to be honest with you about what went through my mind in that moment, because I'm not proud of where my thoughts went. Though I think most men in my position would have gone there too. I thought about Danny's promise. I thought about all the men I'd served alongside who'd come home only to find their wives had moved on, moved out, moved somebody else into the bed they used to share. I thought I was about to become one more entry in that particular ledger. One more soldier story that doesn't end on a battlefield, but in a driveway, staring at a lit window that used to belong to him and didn't anymore. I didn't confront her that night. I checked into a motel off the highway instead. The same one my father used to take my mother to on their anniversary, back before he passed, and I lay on top of the covers in my dress uniform until the sun came up, running through every version of the conversation I thought I was about to have, none of them ending anywhere good. The next few weeks were among the hardest of my entire life, and I want you to understand that statement includes the 2 years I spent overseas. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, that fully prepares a man for watching his marriage come apart in slow motion, in a town where everybody knows your name and everybody pretends not to notice you sitting alone in a diner booth, built for two, your coffee going cold while you stare out the window at a street you grew up on. My mother tried to help in the only way she knew how, which mostly meant feeding me and asking careful, sideways questions over breakfast. My father-in-law, a quiet man named Walt who'd never had much use for conversation, even in the best of times, started finding excuses to stop by my mother's house whenever I was there, just to sit with me on the porch without saying much of anything, which somehow helped more than words would have. I didn't know it then, but Walt already knew what was happening with his daughter. He was one of maybe 3 people in that whole town who did, and he carried that knowledge like a second promise, silent and heavy, the same way I was carrying mine. Emily and I talked eventually, in stiff, careful conversations, the kind 2 people have when they're walking across ice they don't trust to hold their weight. She wouldn't explain the letter. She kept saying things like, "It's better this way, and you deserve more than what I can give you right now." And every time I pushed for a real answer, a real reason, she'd shut the conversation down like a door closing on a draft, quick and final, leaving me standing on the wrong side of it every time. I saw the man again. Twice more that first month. Same sedan, same leather bag, same hushed conversations on the porch, that always seemed to end the moment my truck turned into the driveway. My mother, who has never once in her life been able to keep a piece of gossip to herself for more than a day, finally told me what half the town apparently already suspected, or thought they knew, or had decided to believe regardless of whether it was true. Everybody's saying she's been seeing somebody. She told me one morning over coffee at her kitchen table, not quite meeting my eyes, turning her mug around and around in her hands like it needed the attention more than I did. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, honey, but I figured you'd rather hear it from me than from Linda down at the beauty shop, who'll add 3 extra details that aren't even true. I want to tell you what that did to a man who had just spent 2 years trusting the people beside him with his actual life, his actual survival, every single day. It's one thing to be afraid of dying in a foreign country. It's an entirely different, quieter kind of fear to come home and find yourself afraid of the truth sitting across the table in your own mother's kitchen. I started watching the house. I'm not proud of this either, but grief and suspicion have a way of making a man do things he wouldn't otherwise let himself do. I parked down the street some evenings, the same way I used to watch a compound before a patrol back in country. Except this time it was my own life I was surveilling, my own wife I had turned into a stranger to study from a careful distance through a windshield. I saw the sedan come and go on something like a schedule. Tuesdays and Fridays, usually in the late afternoon. Right around the time the light started turning gold and long across the yard. I saw Emily walk the man to his car sometimes, saw her hold his forearm in a way that made my chest feel like it was being slowly closed in a vice I had no way of loosening. There was a night, maybe the worst night of that whole stretch, when I nearly did something I would have regretted for the rest of my life. I'd had 2 beers too many at a bar on the edge of town, nursing a kind of anger I didn't fully recognize as grief wearing a disguise, and I drove past the house and saw the sedan parked in the driveway, and something in me came unhooked. I sat in my truck at the end of the block with my hands shaking on the wheel, and for one long, terrible minute, I thought seriously about walking up to that door and doing something I couldn't take back. It was Walt, of all people, who saved me from that version of myself. He called my cell out of nowhere. I still don't know how he knew to call right then, whether it was instinct or whether somebody had tipped him off, and he talked to me for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. About a fence he was fixing, about a dog he used to have, until my hands stopped shaking and the anger drained back down into whatever quieter shape it usually wore. I've never told him how close I came that night. I think somehow he already knows. I confronted Emily directly on a Friday evening in early November. I remember the date because the leaves had just about finished falling, and the whole yard was carpeted in them. And I remember thinking it was strange that something could look so peaceful while everything inside me was on fire. "Who is he?" I asked her, standing in our own kitchen, like a man asking a question he already suspected he wasn't going to like the answer to. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something cross her face I hadn't seen since I'd been home. Not guilt, exactly. Fear. A different kind of fear than the kind I'd learned to recognize on a battlefield. Quieter, and somehow worse, because it had nowhere to discharge itself. "You need to let this go," she said. "Please. I'm asking you to trust me on this one thing, just this once. You want a divorce, Emily. You want me to sign papers and to disappear. And now there's a man showing up at our house twice a week with a bag like he's got something to hide. And you want me to trust you? I trusted you every single night for 2 years in a place where trust was the only thing standing between me and not coming home at all. I think I've earned better than a locked door and a letter." She started crying then, and I want to tell you. Watching my wife cry without being able to comfort her, without even knowing whether I had the right to try anymore, was worse than any physical wound I ever took overseas. Physical pain, a man can learn to manage. That other kind, the kind where you're standing 3 feet from someone you love and it feels like a canyon has opened up between you, doesn't come with any training at all. "I can't tell you," she said. "Not yet. I need more time." Time for what? She wouldn't answer that. She went upstairs, and a moment later I heard the bedroom door lock, a sound I had never once heard in the 8 years we'd been married. A small mechanical click that landed on me like a verdict, and I stood alone in that kitchen with the porch light buzzing faintly outside the window, feeling more like a stranger in my own life than I had ever felt in a war zone 8,000 miles from home. I spent that night on the couch and most of the nights after it. We fell into a strange, brittle rhythm, polite in the mornings, careful with each other over dinner if we ate together at all, both of us skirting around the actual subject like it was a live wire neither of us wanted to touch. I lost weight that month. I stopped sleeping through the night, though I told myself it was just the adjustment, the thing every returning soldier goes through, and not the specific grief of watching a marriage I'd give anything to save slip through my fingers one careful, locked door night at a time. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it's important you understand I'm not proud of it, even though it's the thing that eventually led me to the truth. I followed her. 2 Tuesdays later, when the sedan pulled away from the house instead of pulling into it, I got in my truck and followed at a distance. The way we used to track a vehicle overseas, staying 3 or 4 cars back, watching from angles that kept me hidden, my whole body running on the same cold, focused adrenaline I used to feel before a patrol. I expected a motel. I braced myself for the kind of place men take women they aren't supposed to be with. And I had already started rehearsing, somewhere in the back of my mind, exactly what I'd say when I got there. Instead, I watched Emily's car turn into the parking lot of Sacred Heart Medical Center, 40 minutes outside of town, and pull into a section marked for outpatient services. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for the second time in 2 months, staring at a building instead of a house, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, my carefully rehearsed speech dissolving into nothing. I followed her inside, keeping some distance, moving through those wide fluorescent-lit hallways the way I used to move through unfamiliar terrain, watching everything, giving nothing away. I watched her walk up to a reception desk on the 3rd floor. I watched her sign a clipboard without hesitation like it was routine. I watched a nurse call her name 15 minutes later, and I watched her disappear through a set of double doors with a sign hanging above them that I will never, for as long as I live, be able to forget. Oncology. I stood in that hallway for I don't know how long. Time does strange things to a man in moments like that. It stretches and collapses all at once, like taffy pulled too far and then let go. I remember a vending machine humming somewhere down the corridor. I remember the particular smell of the place, that hospital smell, that gets into the back of your throat and stays there. I remember thinking about Danny, about holding pressure on a wound with my own bare hands and promising a dying man I'd take care of his family. And I remember thinking, with a kind of horror that still wakes me up some nights, even now, that I might be about to lose my wife to something I couldn't hold pressure against. Something no amount of training, no amount of courage, no amount of love could fight for her directly. I could only stand beside it. I found a nurse at the station and asked, as calmly as I could manage, which was not calm at all, what department this was, even though some part of me already knew, even though I needed to hear it said out loud by somebody else's mouth to make it fully real. She told me kindly but firmly that I'd need to speak with the patient directly for any information. And she was right to say that, and I understood exactly why, even as I nearly came apart right there in that hallway in front of strangers, holding clipboards and paper cups of coffee. I didn't wait for Emily to come out. I couldn't. I went outside and sat on a bench near the entrance, my hands not quite steady, and I called the man in the sedan. I'd found his name on a business card weeks earlier, tucked in a kitchen junk drawer, without thinking much of it at the time. The kind of thing you register and then forget, until it comes roaring back into relevance all at once. Dr. Marcus Webb. It turned out he wasn't her lover at all. He was her oncologist, and the leather bag I'd built an entire false narrative around was a portable equipment case he used for at-home follow-up visits, for patients who had trouble getting to the hospital during certain stretches of treatment. He wouldn't give me details over the phone, and he shouldn't have, patient privacy being what it is, a rule I respected even as it was killing me not to know more. But he told me enough. He told me my wife had been diagnosed 5 months earlier, 3 full months before I'd even come home. Stage 3. He told me she'd been undergoing treatment quietly, telling almost no one, because she didn't want word getting back to me overseas. She was terrified that if I found out, I'd lose focus, in a place where losing focus gets men killed. Not just the man who loses it, but the men standing next to him. She made her own mother promise not to write me a single word about it, not one sentence, not even a hint buried in a line about the weather. She endured the diagnosis and the first grueling rounds of treatment completely alone so that I could come home in one piece, instead of coming home distracted, grieving, and half a step slower than I needed to be while I still had a job to finish overseas. And the divorce papers. The divorce papers weren't about falling out of love with me. They were, in the most twisted and backward way grief and fear and love can tangle themselves together inside a person, the single most loving thing she thought she had left to give me. I found this out properly a few days later, sitting on the stairs in a conversation I wasn't meant to overhear but did anyway. Like a kid eavesdropping on his own life through a banister. She told her sister she didn't want me to spend however many years I had left married to a dying woman. She had watched her own father waste away slowly over 3 long years, had watched her mother's spirit erode alongside him, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing recognizable left of the woman who'd raised her. She didn't want that particular fate for me. She thought, In whatever exhausted, frightened logic a person trees for at 2 in the morning after months of secrecy, that the kindest thing she could possibly do was set me free before I even knew what exactly I was being freed from. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I believe it's the actual heart of this whole story, more than the war, more than the twist, more than any of it. My wife was willing to face a life-threatening illness completely alone, to push away the person she loved most in the entire world, because she loved him too much to let him suffer alongside her. That is not the logic of somebody who has stopped loving you. That is the logic of somebody who loves you so much it terrifies her. I drove straight back to that hospital and sat in that same waiting room until she came out. And when those double doors finally opened and she saw me sitting there, I watched every wall she'd spent 5 months carefully building come apart all at once, right there in a public hallway with strangers walking past. She didn't ask how I knew. She just walked toward me, slow and unsteady, like she wasn't entirely sure her own legs would hold her weight. And I stood up and caught her before she even needed catching. And we stood in that hallway holding on to each other while the hospital carried on moving around us. Nurses, gurneys, the distant quiet beeping of some machine down another corridor. And neither one of us said a single word for a long, long time. We didn't need to. Some conversations don't happen in language at all. Some conversations happen entirely in the way two people refuse, absolutely refuse, to let go of each other. "You should hate me," she finally said into my chest, her voice muffled and cracked. "I lied to you for months. I tried to push you away right when you needed a home to come back to more than you'd ever needed anything. I don't hate you," I told her, and I meant it more completely than I'd ever meant anything. "I think you're the strongest person I have ever known. And Emily, I have known some strong people. I've watched men do things under fire that should be impossible for a human body to do. And I'm telling you right now, standing in this hallway, that what you did, facing this alone, for months, so I could come home safe, takes more courage than anything I've ever managed to do in 11 years of service. I want to be honest about what came after all of this, because this isn't a story where everything suddenly got easy just because the truth finally came out into the open. Truth is a beginning. It was never going to be an ending. And I think anybody who's lived through something like this already understands that in their bones. The months that followed were some of the hardest of both our lives, harder in some ways than anything that had come before, because now the enemy had a name and a face and a treatment schedule, and there was no ridgeline to return fire at, no clear target to fix in your sights. Chemotherapy is a battle entirely its own, waged in infusion chairs and waiting rooms, and 3 in the morning bathroom floors. And I learned that fighting for someone you love against something you cannot see, cannot outmaneuver, cannot shoot back at, requires a different kind of courage than anything my training had ever prepared me for. I learned to sit in waiting rooms for 6-7 hours at a stretch, learning the particular rhythms of daytime television I'd never had reason to know before. I learned to hold a bucket at 3 in the morning without flinching, the same steady hands that had once held pressure on Danny's wound now holding my wife's hair back instead. And somewhere in the middle of that terrible symmetry, I found a kind of peace I hadn't expected to find anywhere ever again. I learned to recognize the particular exhaustion on her face that meant she needed quiet, and the different exhaustion that meant she needed me to talk about anything at all, absolutely anything, just to fill the room with a sound that wasn't the sound of her own fear. I learned that love, real love, the kind that actually survives something like this, isn't the version you see in movies, all sweeping music and dramatic declarations. It's quieter than that. It's smaller and harder, and it shows up in unglamorous rooms at unglamorous hours, and it never once asks for anything in return. There were bad stretches. I won't pretend otherwise. There was a scan in the 4th month that came back ambiguous, and the 2 weeks we spent waiting for a follow-up biopsy were, without exaggeration, worse than anything I lived through in either deployment. Because in a deployment, at least you know roughly what shape the danger takes. Waiting for those results, I understood for the first time what my mother must have felt every single day I was overseas, checking the news, flinching at every unfamiliar car that slowed down near our street. I called her that week from the hospital parking lot and apologized to her properly for the first time in my life for every sleepless night I'd ever put her through without knowing it. She cried on the phone. I cried too, and I didn't try to hide it from her the way I might have before all of this. The follow-up biopsy came back clear. False alarm, the doctor called it. Like those 2 weeks hadn't nearly hollowed us both out completely. Emily laughed when she heard the news. That same laugh from 10th grade chemistry class, the one that came out before she meant it to. And I realized sitting there in that small consultation room that I would spend the rest of my life chasing that particular sound, The same as I had at 17 years old with a drop binder scattered across a high school hallway. There's one more thread I have to tell you about, because I made a promise, and a promise made to a dying man in a war zone doesn't come with an expiration date just because you make it home. About 4 months into Emily's treatment, a young man showed up at our front door. 23 years old, dark hair, standing on the porch in a nervous way that told me he wasn't sure he was welcome before he'd even said a word. His name was Marcus Reyes, Danny's older brother. I'd tried to find him for months after I'd first gotten back, working through army channels, calling numbers that led nowhere, but grief and paperwork and my own unraveling life had gotten in the way of keeping that promise the way I knew I should have. Marcus had found me instead, through a mutual contact from Danny's old unit, and he stood on my porch holding his little niece's photograph in his wallet. The very same photograph Danny used to keep taped inside his helmet. And he told me his family had come apart at the seams after Danny died. Danny's young wife struggling to raise their daughter alone. No real support system, drowning in debt from funeral costs the Army's benefits hadn't fully covered, working 2 jobs the same way Emily once had, back before either of our lives had taken the turns they'd taken. I looked at that young man standing on my porch, nervous and hopeful all at once, and I looked back through the screen door at my own wife inside, fighting for her life with a strength I still don't fully understand even now. And I understood something in that moment I don't think I could have understood before any of this had happened to me. Love isn't a finite resource you have to ration out carefully in case you run dry somewhere down the line. The more of it you manage to give away, even in the hardest seasons, the more of it seems to find its way back to you, from directions you never would have expected to look. Emily and I, even in the thick of her treatment, even with our own bills stacking up and our own fear keeping us both awake some nights, found a way to help Danny's family. We started small. Groceries left on a porch. Gas money slipped into a card. Emily, bald from the chemo by then but somehow still finding the energy to laugh, taught herself to braid hair over a video call so she could show Danny's widow how to do her daughter's hair the exact way Danny used to talk about wanting to do it himself someday. Back when the future still felt guaranteed to him, we didn't have much to give. But it turns out that not much, shared with somebody who has even less, stretches further than either party expects it to. Marcus started visiting more regularly after that, sometimes bringing his niece with him, a small, serious girl with Danny's same dark eyes, who took to calling Emily Miss M within about a week of meeting her. Watching that little girl climb up onto the couch next to my wife during her worst weeks, chattering about her day at school while Emily sat wrapped in a blanket too thin to really warm anyone, taught me something about resilience. I don't think I could have learned any other way. Some griefs, it turns out, only get lighter when you let somebody else's smaller grief lean up against yours. Emily finished her final round of treatment on a Tuesday in March, 14 months to the week after I'd first stood in that parking lot at Fort Campbell, holding a letter I had completely misunderstood. Her scans came back clear 3 months after that. I was in the room when the doctor told her. I watched my wife cry the good kind of tears for what felt like the first time in over a year, and I held her the same way I'd held her in that hospital hallway all those months before, except this time there was no fear woven into it at all. Just relief and gratitude and a kind of love that had been tested in ways most marriages never once have to face, and had come out on the other side of it stronger, not in spite of everything we'd gone through, but somehow impossibly because of it. We threw a small party that spring, nothing fancy, just family, and a few close friends gathered in the backyard under the same old oak tree her mother had strung lights on the night before our wedding. Walt grilled too much food, the way he always insisted on doing for any occasion that called for celebrating. Marcus came with his niece in tow, and at some point in the evening I watched Danny's daughter running barefoot through the grass with my own niece and nephew, all 3 of them laughing at something none of the adults were in on, and I thought about a promise made in the dirt of a valley on the other side of the world. And I thought, for the first time since that day, that I had finally, fully kept it. I think about Danny often, still, more than most people would probably guess. I think about the promise I made him with my hands pressed against a wound that couldn't be saved. I think about how keeping that promise led me, eventually and in a roundabout way I never could have predicted, to a deeper truth about my own marriage than I ever would have uncovered otherwise, and how it ended up connecting 2 grieving families in a way that gave both of us something solid to hold on to besides just our own private pain. Here's what I've learned, and I hope you'll carry at least some part of it with you tonight. Whoever you are, wherever you're listening from, the people we love don't always protect us the way we would choose to be protected if we had a say in the matter. Sometimes love looks like silence, when what we wanted more than anything was honesty. Sometimes it looks like distance, when what we wanted was closeness. Sometimes the person pushing you away the hardest is the very same person who loves you too much to let you watch them suffer up close. Before you assume the worst about somebody you love, before you let fear write the whole story for you in the dark, ask yourself honestly whether there's a version of the truth you haven't fully considered yet. Sometimes the person you're convinced is leaving you is actually trying, in the only broken, imperfect way she knows how, to save you from something. Love isn't proven in the easy seasons. Anybody can love well when nothing hard is being asked of them. It's proven in parking lots, holding letters that break your heart open. It's proven in hospital hallways, holding on to someone who genuinely believed she had no choice but to let you go. It's proven in the promises we choose to keep to people who can no longer be here to ask us to keep them. If this story moved you even a little tonight, I'd ask two small things of you before you go. Leave a comment and tell me about somebody in your own life who loved you in a way you didn't fully understand until much later. Sometimes years later. And if you know somebody who needs to hear tonight that it's not too late to fight for the people they love, share this with them. Sometimes the smallest act of passing something along is exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous love this whole story has been about from the very first sentence. Before I let you go tonight, I want to tell you about one more evening because I think it belongs at the end of this story more than anywhere else. It was almost 2 years after that first parking lot, almost a year to the day after Emily's scans came back clear, and we were sitting on our own back porch, the same porch where a stranger's headlights used to make my stomach drop, watching the sun go down over a yard that had finally gone back to just being an ordinary yard again. Nothing more, nothing less. Emily's hair had grown back by then, shorter than she used to wear it, with a little more curl in it than before, which she joked was the one decent thing chemo ever gave her. She had her feet up in my lap, and I was tracing absent circles on her ankle the way I used to do on nights when neither of us felt much like talking, and she said no, the way she always used to when something had been sitting with her a while before she finally let it out. I keep thinking about that letter. I asked her what she meant, though some part of me already knew. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually going through with it, she said. Not the diagnosis. The letter. There were nights, before you came home, where I really believed leaving was the kinder thing. I had it all planned out in my head. I was going to disappear quietly, let you grieve a marriage instead of a wife, because I thought that would hurt you less in the long run. I actually believed that. I sat right here on this porch and I convinced myself it was love. I told her what I've told her more times since than I could count, because I think some truths need saying more than once before they fully settle into a person. I told her that love isn't measured by how much pain you're willing to absorb alone on somebody else's behalf. It's measured by how much you're willing to let somebody else stand beside you in it, even when standing beside you costs them something too. She'd had that backward for months, and it nearly cost us everything. And I understood exactly why she'd gotten there. And I forgave her for it completely. The same way I hope somebody would forgive me for whatever mistakes fear talks me into someday. We got a dog that same year, a scruffy mutt from the shelter 2 towns over that Danny's daughter picked out for us on one of her visits, insisting with all the authority of a 7-year-old that this particular dog had sad eyes like Uncle Danny's picture, which none of the adults in the room had the heart to argue with. We named him Scout. He sleeps at the foot of our bed most nights, and some mornings when I wake up before Emily does, I lie there for a while just listening to her breathe, still not entirely used to how ordinary that sound gets to be again, how much of a gift ordinary turns out to be once you've come close enough to losing it. There's a smaller moment I've never told anyone outside of Emily and my mother, and I think it belongs here too, because it's the moment I finally understood how much of my own healing had been tangled up in hers without my noticing. About 8 months into her remission, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the back door closing. I found her standing barefoot in the grass in her nightgown, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, just looking up at the stars the way she used to when we were teenagers parked out on the back roads with nowhere in particular to be. I asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing was wrong, that for the first time in almost 2 years she'd woken up and realized she hadn't spent a single second of the day being afraid, and it had unsettled her so completely she needed to stand outside and make sure it was real. I stood out there with her a long while, the two of us saying nothing, just breathing the same cold air, and I remember thinking that some victories don't come with fireworks. Some of them just arrive quietly in backyard at 2 in the morning and ask you to notice them before they slip away again. Marcus and his niece still come by most Sundays. Danny's widow remarried a couple of years back, a good man from her church who treats that little girl like his own, and when Marcus told me the news, sitting on this same porch with a beer in his hand, He said something I haven't been able to shake since. He said, Danny would have liked him. Danny would have been glad she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. I think about that sentence every time I look at Emily across a room and remember how close I came to letting her carry something alone too. Out of nothing more than my own fear and misplaced pride. I don't have a clean bow to tie around any of this, and I don't think real stories usually come with one. Emily still goes in for scans every 6 months, and every single time in the days leading up to it, some small old fear stirs awake in both of us, quieter than it used to be but never fully gone. I've learned to sit with that fear instead of fighting it, the same way I learned to sit in waiting rooms without needing to fill the silence. Some things you don't get to defeat outright. You just learn how to carry them without letting them carry you instead. If you take nothing else from tonight, take this. Somewhere out there is somebody who loves you enough to have made a mistake trying to protect you from something. Somewhere out there is somebody carrying a promise on your behalf that you don't even know has been made. Don't wait for a hospital hallway to find out who they are. Ask the hard question today while you still have the chance to hear the whole answer. And while you still have the chance to say the only thing that ever really needed saying in the first place, that whatever it is, you'd rather carry it together. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. And to every man and woman who has ever worn this country's uniform, and to every spouse who held a home together while they were gone, sometimes carrying far more than any of us ever knew, I see you. Your story matters too, and it deserves to be told with the same care as anybody else's.